Hi, it's Dennis Daly. Over the years, I've done a lot of public speaking, in addition to what I've done on radio. There were 4 major speeches I delivered when I was asked by civic groups such as Kiwanis and Rotary and Lions to come talk to them. This one is called The Fire in the Sky. It's the history of radio. A wise man once said, "Wherever we go, that is where we are." And I know that sounds pretty simplistic, but it also implies that when we get there, we're alone. But that is not the case. You see, wherever we go in the galaxy, something else is with us. Some things that are magic, things from which we cannot escape. We are saturated with them. We can go to the top of Mount Everest. We can go to the lowest depths of the ocean. We can scale the Great Wall of China. We can even ride the Channel train under the English Channel. We can visit the moon, and they are there too. We are technically never alone. They pierce our bodies. They are in every cell. Most of the time, though, we are unaware of that invasion unless we seek them out. At this very moment, the room is full of them, ceiling to floor, wall to wall. But even before man understood what that invasion was, even before he made his first early halting attempts to understand them, to make friends with them, they were here. From the first eruption of a volcano to the flash of lightning in the sky, when a lion runs through dry grass, these things sparked and flew and lit. They swirled. They fascinated early man with an aurora of light. From the first days of man, they were there, wild, random, powerful, unstoppable. Man has been surrounded by them all of his life. But he would go millions of years conscious of them, but not thinking much about them. Their presence, though, began to interest scientists, and learned men began to ask questions. Finally, in 1894, a young, charismatic Italian inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, found a better way to study them. He harnessed the fire in the sky, and his inventions would spark a revolution. But before we go back to Marconi's workshop, let's go forward to today. Tune in any AM radio and then put it near a motor or a fluorescent bulb, or hold it in a thunderstorm. The radio speaker will crackle and scream with a flood of interference. You see, Mother Nature is full of unlicensed radio transmitters, and we call all of that static. But to Marconi, static was music to his ears. He wondered if it would be possible to find a way to copy Mother Nature's static and make his own, to make tiny, intense bolts of lightning that would burn their way through the air, ionizing it as they went. How could he make a machine to make sparks? Well, he created a gap, allowed electricity to jump across it, and made mini lightning. It worked fine, but how could he prove it was working? He created his sparking machine to produce a short burst, and then another one, and then a long burst, and random bursts that could be picked up, and finally he did make what we would now call a receiver. And he was amazed that he could differentiate his static from the random static in the air because he was sending it out in a pattern. He would send a short burst and then a long one, a short one and then a long one, and then he realized he was sending out the letter A in Morse code. He took his invention to England, and he tried it out on Salisbury Plain in the shadow of Stonehenge. First, he could hear his special static a mile away, then 2 miles, then finally 8 miles, and to a point across the horizon. He had done what no man had ever done before, not with tom-toms or jungle drums, not ship to ship with flags and semaphores or puffs of smoke from native people's fires, and not down wires strung pole to pole by early telegraph companies. Marconi had harnessed the fire in the sky, electromagnetic waves, radio waves, and he had taught them to talk through the very air that had crackled with static. He had cut the umbilical cord of communications. He had harnessed the fire in the sky, and wireless was born. For more than 2 decades, though, wireless was simply point-to-point communications. Marconi had become an international celebrity. He set up a large company in the U.S. to outfit ships and shore stations. They used it to facilitate the movement of cargo and to improve their safety. Through all of this, he became powerful and wealthy. He was a man with a vision of taking thoughts and ideas and warnings and timetables, messages and information, converting them to Morse code, dots and dashes, and sending them from point A to point B via wireless. But his vision was limited. Others would take up that idea and build on it. One of those visionaries was a Canadian inventor named Reginald Fessenden. It was a cold Christmas Eve in 1906. The weather was blustery off the coast of New England. Hundreds of radio operators on ships were winding down the day's work. Except for some special notices, there is not much ship-to-shore traffic on Christmas Eve. Some of the sailors stranded on ships anchored off the States and the Canadian maritime provinces had asked their radio operators to send "sorry I can't be with you tonight" messages, but that was just about it. The temperature began to drop, and snow began to fall. As midnight neared, many radio men took off their headphones and headed for hot coffee and donuts. On bigger ships, they went to church. It would be those few radio operators who stayed at their posts who would become a party to one of the most important moments in the history of communications. Something beyond their wildest expectations was about to happen. Suddenly, the sound of the static changed. What emerged from their headphones was not the familiar dots and dashes of Morse code, but something else, something no one had ever heard before through a radio. It was Silent Night, played on a violin by Reginald Fessenden in a radio shack on the New England coast. And after the music died, they heard him say something else. He was speaking. Reginald Fessenden said, "Merry Christmas." Were these operators dreaming? Was the spirit of Christmas getting the best of them? Wireless, you see, was not supposed to be like that. It's dots and dashes, cut and dried, point to point. But Fessenden sent out a message to anyone. He found a way to pierce the static in the air with recognizable human sounds. It was a Christmas gift the world would treasure forever. Sadly, a man who was working at the same time as Fessenden would get most of the glory. A strange little man named DeForest would claim that he was the father of radio. And despite the fact that Fessenden technically beat him to the punch, in many ways, DeForest was correct. His method of putting the human voice on the air was like Fessenden's, only it was slicker. He developed a radio tube he called the Audion. He took a 2-element tube invented by a Britisher, Fleming, and he added a grid between the internal elements. You see, by changing the voltage of that grid, he could change the way the electricity jumped from one side of the tube to the other. He could create modulation. Without the ability to change the texture of a signal, the transmission of the human voice was really not possible. In a studio in New York City, he had local singers perform. He shared with Fessenden the idea that radio was more than point-to-point communications, that it could be used in DeForest words to bring music into everyone's home. At the time, only hobbyists tuned in, but the exploits became publicized. Stores offered to build radios for people. DeForest broadcast Enrico Caruso from the stage of the New York Metropolitan Opera. He traveled to Paris on his honeymoon and sent signals from the top of the Eiffel Tower. Suddenly, everyone was aware of radio. It was not long before investors started getting into it, and then broadcasting would reach a new plateau. Would the government grant licenses to companies to make a profit from programming? Would those stations be able to sell radio time? Would what was once a hobbyist toy be turned into a paying venture that would eventually become a billion-dollar industry? In the early 1920s, the Westinghouse Company in Pittsburgh used its new license for KDKA to broadcast election returns, and radio news was born. Along the way, the growing world of radio would be populated with a long list of characters, most of them working in the background, unknown to the general public. Foremost among them was Edwin Howard Armstrong. Now, as a boy, he was fascinated by radio from the beginning. But listening at night in his Yonkers, New York bedroom to radio sets that he made himself, he had the same problem that DeForest and Marconi had had since day one. It was difficult to pick up weak radio stations. There had to be a better way, and the teenage Armstrong found it. One night at 2 a.m, he suddenly found that faraway Marconi stations to which he had been listening not only came in louder on his headphones, but louder to a magnitude of 1,000 times. He simply picked up a weak signal and injected it back on itself. He did it again and again, almost to the point of causing howling feedback, but not quite. His feedback, or heterodyne circuit, would revolutionize radio, making reception of weak signals possible. Later, after being made a major by the Army for his work in World War I, increasing the range of airborne radios for the Army Signal Corps, he would take his old feedback circuit and make it more sophisticated. He came up with the super heterodyne circuit. He sold the idea to RCA. That company and its young president, David Sarnoff, would use Armstrong's super heterodyne and his other inventions to drive RCA to the pinnacle of the radio business. And something else we forget about this gifted man. For years, he looked for a way to produce a cleaner AM sound, to somehow come up with a way to filter out the static, the fire in the sky that started all of this. Then one night, he said he had a dream. He thought of a way to make an entirely new means of radio transmission. He called it frequency modulation. The world would call it FM. But Armstrong's old friends at RCA didn't want to invest in it because they were working on something else. So they went on to perfect television. Armstrong developed FM alone, and some smaller companies eventually helped. Finally, when RCA premiered television, it convinced the government that the sound should be broadcast on FM. But they called it something else. They denied Armstrong all the money from his patent. Ask any electrical engineer who the greatest hero of the 20th century is, and almost all of them would say Edwin Howard Armstrong. But sadly, Armstrong thought he was a failure. On New Year's Eve, 1953, he stepped from the 13th floor balcony of his New York City apartment. The man who was the father of AM and FM was dead, but his inventions live on. Soon everybody wanted a radio station. Large newspapers, funeral homes, chiropractors, even bakeries, and just plain people applied for a license to the Federal Trade Commission. They bought the equipment, they hired a staff, and they got on the air. The American appetite for what would become a new piece of furniture in their home was insatiable. In less than 5 years, a network of stations was put together. NBC. Less than a year later, millions in 25 states would hear Charles Lindbergh as he was welcomed back from Paris. Some even heard pioneer newsman Lowell Thomas doing the coverage. America was hooked on radio for good. Because you see, in less than 20 years, radio went from dots and dashes and primitive squeaking sounds to organized broadcasting that was producing award-winning radio shows. Vaudeville stars who once played to several hundred people a day were playing to an audience of millions. Burns and Allen, Jack Benny, Fred Allen, Kate Smith became household names. The Shadow, The Lone Ranger, Tom Mix, serials, soap operas, comedies, and news broadcasts began to fascinate America. The exploits of Jack Armstrong and Sergeant Preston would be discussed not only at school, but around the office water fountain. But amid all of this, the Great Depression was growing, and there were war clouds on the horizon. No American president ever used the power and impact of radio better than did Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because he was able to use the strength of his voice, his on-the-air persona masked the fact that he was crippled with polio and confined to a wheelchair. But on radio, FDR was a giant. It was during his run for office that he used the fledgling medium of radio to promise a new deal for America. But he gave few specifics. America was waiting. Then on March the 4th, 1933, he would get his chance to explain his New Deal in homes and stores, in churches and taverns, cars, taxis, and hotel rooms. America waited. What would he say? What would FDR say that would signal the rebirth of America? We have nothing to fear but fear itself. Roosevelt's words, transmitted to the far corners of America via radio, jump-started the American psyche. On March 4th, 1933, as one historian put it, a man who could not walk would begin to lead a crippled nation. The miracle of radio was that it brought about a new national connection. When the new medium was in its infancy, few people in rural America even had electricity. What batteries they did have were expensive, and batteries powered their radios. Unlike today, where people leave the radio on all the time as background, many rural families turned on the set just seconds before the program they wanted to hear, and they turned it off when the last joke was over. But for the time, people in the Appalachians suddenly felt connected. In the Great Plains, the desert Southwest, on American Indian reservations, on ships in the Great Lakes, and in the bayous of Louisiana, these people were suddenly included in an expanding American family. The process of broadcasting meant that the rest of the country was reaching out. Laughing at a comedian was something you could do every day. Entertainment no longer occasionally found its way down the river on a showboat or arrived by train to a vaudeville house that could be hundreds of miles away. Now, by simply turning a knob, if the weather was right, Americans could sit around a massive pot-bellied stove in a continent-wide country store and share the laughter and the tears and the national news. Radio made this inclusion possible. It had become the cement that began to glue the nation together at a vital hour. On an instant, second-by-second basis, radio was doing what newspapers had tried to do earlier, tell Americans everywhere what other Americans were doing. But there was more than that. This piece of crackling furniture talked to people one-on-one. The announcers and the stars became their friends. The lonely had a companion. Housewives were entertained as they did their daily chores. Ranchers got the stock prices without going to town. Farmers knew it was a good day to sell their wheat. As never before, the country was moving in unison. The miracle of broadcasting, though, was a novelty for years until something happened in this country that provided an opportunity for radio to prove that it was more than an attractive music box. It would in many ways save the nation. A young journalist named Edwin R Murrow was sent to London to set up a news bureau for CBS in advance of anticipated war there. The network knew that if things happened as predicted, coverage from Europe would be essential. Not all the members of his new staff had great voices. When one of them filed a report back to New York, the head of CBS wired Murrow to explain why he had hired a reporter with such an un-radio voice. Murrow wired back, "Do you want someone who can talk or someone who knows what he's talking about?" That reporter was Eric Sevareid. Walter Cronkite would begin his wartime radio career working for United Press, but would later join CBS. Murrow began making live reports every night from rooftops as German buzz bombs rained death on London. He would later describe the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camps in terms gut-wrenching that today are hard to read without sobbing. He ended his report by saying, "If I have offended you by this otherwise mild account of what I have seen at Buchenwald, I am not the least bit sorry." Radio took us through World War II with Roosevelt rallying the nation from his wheelchair, Churchill telling the world of his nation's finest hour, and the stars of radio telling us to buy more war bonds. America was united around the radio speaker. It heard CBS's John Charles Daly announce Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and again it heard Daly announce that FDR had died at Warm Springs. The euphoria of peace would expand the horizons of radio, and a little invention that Allied soldiers found at German radio headquarters in Berlin would revolutionize the way radio production was done. It was the magnetic tape recorder. The shows that were done after the war using this new technology, because they were mastered on tape, not on scratchy discs, sound live even when played today. Gunsmoke, Dragnet, The Adventures of Philip Marlowe. But in less than 10 years, the advertisers would go elsewhere and the actors would move to television. Some network shows hung on, for not all of America had TV yet. But on September 30th, 1962, when the CBS program Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar signed off, radio died. A little over a year later, America would make a remarkable transition. On November 22nd, 1963, millions would hear that President John Kennedy had been shot. They would hear the bulletin on radio, but they would watch the funeral on television. It is funny, if you go into the street and ask 1,000 people what was the greatest invention of the last century, it is likely that none would say radio. But it's no stretch of the imagination to say that were it not for radio, none of those other inventions would work very well. The computer is internally driven by radio-type signals. Certainly the concept of the airline was developed apart from radio, but from its earliest days, its avionics, its electronics, were based on radio. The ability of planes to communicate and navigate evolved and improved as radio got better. The recent rush to distribute the Internet to little handheld devices would only be a Buck Rogers pipe dream if radio were not possible. The thinking done by fax machines, the cooking of the microwave oven, radar in all of its forms, the cell phone, the automatic garage door opener, the TV remote, laser guns, radio-controlled hobby toys, GPS satellite receivers, automobile systems that call for help after a crash, monitors in baby rooms, pagers, beepers, pacemakers, CAT scan machines, and a million other products. Radio is the lifeblood of the millions of ham radio operators who chat every minute of every day throughout the world, but in times of disaster, abandon their chit-chat to provide vital communications, often serving as the only link in times of disaster. But sadly, this generation seems not to remember that radio is there at all. Has it become masked in the workings of all those other products? Watch the Super Bowl, your television is radio with pictures. How did we forget? At a time when there are millions alive who were born before radio, how could we as a people so quickly take for granted the work of men who made the dream come true? Marconi, DeForest, Sarnoff, Westinghouse, Farnsworth, Fessenden, Murrow, Cronkite, and Edwin Howard Armstrong. There is no national monument to mark this gift of God that came only during the past century. The 100th anniversary of the Fessenden Christmas broadcast was largely ignored. Commemorative postage stamps, well, there are a few, but most honor radio comedians such as Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Burns, and Allen. Maybe it's making too big of a deal to ask for more. Maybe it's too late to expect radio to be honored. Maybe brief moments such as this are the only tributes we have left. But do me a favor. Try to spend 5 minutes today without radio. Don't touch or turn on or use anything that has anything to do with it. You'll find yourself crawling into a cave. But don't bring your cell phone with you because it might ring there. Man harnessed radio waves and put them to use. This generation uses a gift that early man never dreamed of. This generation is part of a global village. This generation harnessed the fire in the sky without ever saying thank you. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed that. I love talking to an audience, so thanks for being here. I'm Dennis Staley.